This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy, How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com.
And welcome, everyone. I'm Jeff Crouere, guest host for the Glazov Gang. We've got a great program lined up for you today. Let me first just thank all of you for watching. Thank all of you for your support of this great program. Remember, it is a fan-generated program, and we certainly do appreciate your support of the Glazov Gang. It allows us to continue to provide you with great content, compelling guests, interesting topics, and hopefully we have got that for you today for this program. So we are coming up on an anniversary of course, the JFK assassination 62 years ago. And it is still a fascinating topic for the American people and really people all over the world. So I thought for today's program, when I was just very pleased to receive the invitation to guest host for Jamie today, I thought what better topic to bring up than the JFK assassination with one of the world's foremost experts. James DiEugenio is with us. He is a well-known author, expert. He's testified before Congress. He's worked with Oliver Stone. We've got a new book we're going to be talking about here, and I think you might have a copy to show everyone, Jim. And welcome to the program, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I hope we have a kind of instructive 50 minutes or whatever.
Yes, that is certainly our goal, because this topic is one that I've found fascinating all the years that I've been on radio and TV. And let's, if we could, talk a little bit first before we get into the various, conspiracies. Talk about JFK as a president, and why, Jim, that JFK was someone that ruffled a lot of feathers, maybe it created enemies.
Well, that's a very big question, because there were very, very few groups that Kennedy did not offend. Okay, by the end of his presidency, all right. For instance, Kennedy was going to get out of the Vietnam War, for one. That's been pretty much proven by the new releases by the so-called Assassination Record Review Board. So this kind of antagonized some of the more hawkish people in the military. Kennedy was working for a rapprochement with Fidel Castro in Cuba. He was also trying to reach for a détente with Khrushchev in Russia. All right. He was also threatening to pull funding for Israel because he knew they were lying to him about creating an atomic bomb at the Dimona reactor in the Negev desert. All right. So all these things that he was doing, which were so different than his predecessor, Eisenhower, these tended to antagonize people in the military and in the CIA. All right. Now, on top of this, there was also Kennedy's brother, Bobby, and his war against organized crime. All right. So it was not just people in the government, it was people outside the government. All right. Okay. And then there was also something that's not very well known, is that Kennedy wanted to sponsor more and more state banks as opposed to the Federal Reserve. All right. And this kind of created some friction between his Secretary of the Treasury, Douglas Dillon, and also people on Wall Street, most notably David Rockefeller. All right. So Kennedy had these points of dispute, all right, by the time of his assassination, or November of 1963, with a lot of different power groups within what we call the Eastern, at that time, the Eastern establishment was where all the big money was. We're way ahead of things like Silicon Valley and Bill Gates and stuff like that. But at that time, that was, the so-called Council on Foreign Relations crowd,
Right.
And what they call the Eastern establishment, the Rockefeller, Morgan empires, and stuff like that.
So, Jim, he had a lot of enemies, basically. I mean, he ruffled a lot of feathers. As you said, he went in a different direction from the Eisenhower administration. But I remember, the last warning of Dwight D. Eisenhower when he left office was about the military-industrial complex. And that is something that Kennedy took to heart, correct?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because, as you know, that's the way that Oliver Stone started his movie, 1991 JFK. All right, he started it with Eisenhower's farewell address. All right, and you're exactly right. He did say words of the effect: "Beware the military-industrial complex. We must never let this curtail our freedoms and our liberty, etc." All right, and Kennedy, I believe that the reason Eisenhower did that was because of the shoot down of the U-2, which basically canceled his desired summit meeting with Khrushchev. All right. And I think he always had problems with that as to why they did it at that time, etc. All right. And then the whole thing about Gary Powers being captured, etc. That created a real cause célèbre. And also, if you recall, he tried to deny it. Okay?
Right.
He didn't know that Powers was still alive. All right. And so then when he tried, and Khrushchev produces Powers, okay, where did this guy come from then?
Right.
And so that's why I think he said that. He wanted to come out as a peace president, okay, and he didn't, all right, because of the U-2 shoot down.
Right.
And I believe Kennedy then kind of learned this the hard way, that there was such a thing as, and back then, that term was not, we use it all the time today.
Right.
Military-industrial complex. But back then, it was a rarity.
Right.
Okay, and it was really Eisenhower who kind of put his stamp, on that. And by the way,
and Jim, it's so interesting. Eisenhower, as the Allied Supreme Commander during World War II, I mean, such credentials with the military, and he was speaking from such authority to be able to issue that kind of a warning. So that's what made it incredibly, I think, powerful. Not a peacenik or someone that was anti-military. This man represented our military.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, the military made him what he was. All right. And so when he says something like that, well, something's wrong someplace. Okay, something's wrong someplace.
So, so Kennedy comes into office. We've got the Vietnam situation, got the Cuba situation. You got the mafia that obviously, his brother's going after a full blast. By the way, I happen to know some of the relatives of Carlos Marcello. I'm here in New Orleans, which is a very key part of this whole, as you know, Jim, of this whole Kennedy assassination. So all these different groups that could have been playing a part here, what we call the deep state now, the bureaucracy that, has made this such an interesting conspiracy to try to delve into because I think very few Americans, and you probably know the statistics, believe the narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman and did this on his own. I'm sure it's got to be less than the majority of Americans by this point.
It's between 65 and 70% don't buy the official story. Okay. Now, when Stone's movie came out, if you recall, it zoomed up even further than that. But what has happened is that the MSM, the mainstream media, has done everything it could to try and knock that figure down, but it's still at 65, to 70%. And if you want to talk a little about the Warren Commission,
yes,
the Warren Commission was set up by Lyndon Johnson about a week or so after Kennedy's assassination. It wasn't really his idea. Johnson didn't want a formal blue ribbon kind of committee. He just wanted to go ahead and have Hoover stamp out an FBI report, right, that he would then submit. Okay. But the problem was that, and I'm sure most of your listeners understand this, it wasn't just Kennedy getting killed. It wasn't just Officer Tippit being shot that day. Then, on national television,
right,
live on TV on Sunday,
right,
we have a murder in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters when Jack Ruby jumps forward, one shot into Oswald's stomach with 70 police officers, standing around. Okay. And so this really shocked America.
Right.
All right. And so a lot of people, and not just regular people, but people in the upper echelon said, wait a minute, nobody's going to believe anything that comes out of Dallas.
Right.
After watching this shooting escapade.
And Jim, this is also after Oswald had said he's a patsy, right?
Right. Yeah. That's what he said. That's what he said to the media guys. Okay?
Right.
Being ushered out. I'm just a patsy. All right. And well, when people get shot live on television, they tend, well, why would you do something like that?
Right.
And the obvious first suggestion is they didn't want him to talk. That's why.
Right. Right.
And so, and by the way, let me, on that note, Saturday night, Oswald wanted to make a phone call. This process went through a secretary, and then it went to the Secret Service. Oswald passed a message to the secretary. The secretary gave it to the Secret Service. The Secret Service said, no, we're not going to let him make that phone call. So the secretary ripped up the piece of paper, put it in the trash can. And as that shift was leaving, the other secretary, out of curiosity, picked up that piece of paper. All right? And she brought it home with her. She taped it back together. And the name on the piece of paper was John Hurt. And he was in North Carolina. And it had his phone number. Now think about this for a minute. How the heck did Oswald, who never been to North Carolina, know who this guy was? Okay, and why did he want to talk to him? He was a former military intelligence officer. Okay, and the lady.
So was there any evidence of Oswald spending time with this guy? I mean, what kind of relationship do we know about the two of them?
Well, see, when Victor Marchetti used to be a former CIA officer, and he didn't know about this incident. And when somebody approached him and said, did you know about this? And he showed him, what the piece of paper look like, etc. And Marchetti's looking at this thing, and he says, this was Oswald's cutout, because he'd been in the CIA for 24 years. In other words, if he was going to get in trouble, all right, this was the guy he was supposed to contact. And so this is what most people believe that this was all about.
Right.
He was trying to, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
Oswald really getting worried, are these guys going to frame me? All right, for something I didn't do? And this was his contact to call if he got stuck in that kind of dire straits. All right. Fascinating, isn't it?
So the gentleman that he was trying to call, was he ever interviewed about his relationship with Oswald?
Well, no, of course not. He denied everything.
Okay.
He denied it. The last thing you want to do is admit, yes, I was a contact for Oswald before he
Right.
Okay, All right.
So no, he said nothing to see here. So why did Oswald have his number or call him? He had no explanation for that.
Yeah, well, I think most people today believe that, contrary to what the Warren Commission said, that Oswald was some kind of either military intelligence undercover agent,
Right.
some kind of CIA
Asset, right?
Right. All right. And he was what they call in the trade, which I'm from New Orleans, you must know this, it's called being an agent provocateur.
Right.
That is, you're sent into a group in order to destabilize it and discredit it. And that's what most people believe Oswald was doing with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in 1963.
So he was in New Orleans, and he debated a gentleman who was my radio mentor, the guy who hired me for my first radio job, a man named Ed Butler. I'm sure you're very familiar with him.
Yes, I am.
and of course, he was very pro-Castro, right? And getting into arguments with anti-Castro groups here in New Orleans. So the thinking is that this was all sort of an act that he was doing on behalf of the CIA?
Well, it wasn't just Butler. It was a guy named Carlos Brunier, who was actually a CIA agent with what's called the DRE, the Directory Student National, okay, which was a CIA-sponsored group, all right? And then the third guy was a guy named Bill Stuckey, all right? And he was more or less going to be the host of that program. Now, if you want to hear something really interesting, this just came out of the archives a few months ago. Stuckey was looking for somebody to debate about the Cuba situation in 1962. He actually forwarded a message to the FBI saying, can you arrange a debate on my show, about Castro and Cuba? So in other words, this looks today like it was pre-planned.
Right.
And it was
right.
part of a kind of theatrical event, all right, so that Oswald would blow his cover, which, by the way, he did because he said during the debate that he was under the auspices of the State Department.
Okay,
right. When he went to Russia, because they booby-trapped him, and said, you were a defector to the Soviet Union, weren't you? All right. And so Oswald spilled that out. Then he tried to take it back. I was not under the protection of the State Department.
So let's talk about a sort of a controversial visit that Oswald had down to Mexico City. What was that all about, Jim?
Well, I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm not even sure Oswald went to Mexico City. All right. But for the edification of your listeners, the Warren Commission says that Oswald did go to Mexico City. And this was in late September, very early October of 1963, that Oswald took a bus down to Texas, to Mexico, stayed at something called the Hotel del Comercio in Mexico City, and then visited the Cuban embassy down there and also the Russian embassy. And supposedly he was trying to get a passport, okay, and a visa rather, to go to the Soviet Union, right, through Cuba. Now, he didn't have the proper credentials with him at the time. And so the Russians said, you're going to have to wait. We can't give you a visa right now. All right, you're going to have to wait 3 or 4 months. And by the way, you know something? They did. They actually did send it to him after he was killed. Okay, So this is the story that the Warren Commission latched onto, because one of the people at the Soviet embassy was a guy named Valery Kostakov. And allegedly, Kostakov was in charge of black ops and assassinations in the Western Hemisphere. So the obvious intent was to make it look like Oswald had met with Kostakov, and then something like 7 weeks later, he goes ahead and kills Kennedy, and so therefore he was in the employ of the KGB at the time of the assassination, and the Russians went ahead and pulled the trigger, okay? And by the way, this really spooked Johnson, right? And this is what he used to intimidate Richard Russell and Earl Warren to get them to serve on the Warren Commission. I think he literally said to Warren something like, unless you do this, there's going to be 40 million dead people, in a matter of minutes. Okay?
Right.
And he said the same thing to Richard Russell, who really did not want to be on that committee. All right. Now, as I said, I have some serious doubts about this. And let me give you just a couple of reasons why.
Okay.
The CIA had a battery of cameras in front of the Cuban embassy. They also had a couple of cameras in front of the Russian embassy. One of the cameras in front of the Cuban embassy was called a pulse camera. Why was it called that? Because it was so sensitive that every time there was a change in air pressure in the front door of the Cuban embassy, it would snap a picture. In other words, whenever the door would open and close, it would snap a picture. Now, Oswald visited the Cuban embassy 3 times, the Soviet embassy twice. All right, so just do the arithmetic. There should be 10 pictures of Oswald going in and coming,
And coming out.
Right.
Right.
You know how many there are? None.
Okay.
There's no picture of him going in or going out of either embassy, which is very hard to believe.
Right.
Now, the other problem is this. The night of the assassination, now understand that down in Mexico City, the Russians would tape our embassy, we would tape their embassy, we would tape, the microphones and stuff like that, and tablets,
Right.
etc. Right. So the CIA sends what they say is a voice tape of Oswald. I believe this one was in the Cuban embassy. All right. And they send this up to the border, and then they transport it to Dallas. Well, the next day, Hoover writes a memo and says, the FBI agents sitting in on Oswald's interrogation have heard this tape that the CIA sent up here. And they say it is not the guy that they are talking to. in detention. So in other words, they couldn't find one picture of Oswald. They couldn't find one voice match. Now, this leaves me to begin some doubts about this whole thing.
Right.
There was the woman, okay, Duran, who was the receptionist at the Cuban embassy, all right? And when she was interviewed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, one of the investigators there, a guy named Eddie Lopez, said, would you care to describe this Oswald guy as you knew him? And she said, yeah, he's about as tall as this guy. And she pointed to Gary Cornwall. Gary Cornwall's about 5'5" or 5'6". All right. And he had blonde hair. And so Eddie looks at her and says, he was 5'5" or 5'6", and he had blonde hair.
How tall was Oswald? He wasn't a big guy, right?
Oswald was about 5'9", and he had brown hair.
Right, right.
So these are the problems I have. Okay,
right.
His story. You know.
Now let's fast forward to that fateful day, November 22nd, 1963, where JFK is tragically shot and killed. Is it your belief, Jim, that Oswald took any shots from the book depository? Was he one of the ones who did participate in the murder? What was his role on that day, in your view?
I don't think Oswald took any shots.
Okay.
In Dealey Plaza that day. All right. And the reason I don't think that is because there isn't any evidence that places him where he has to be. Okay, which is on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository.
There are witnesses that place him in the book depository, right?
Well, yeah, because he worked there, but not where what's the so-called sniper's nest.
Right.
On the 6th floor. All right. There isn't any credible evidence that he was. In fact, most of the credible evidence says he was either downstairs on the 2nd floor. There's even photographic evidence that suggests he was outside.
Okay.
In the so-called foyer area. All right. So
was he a marksman? I've heard all kind of various comments where how good of a shot he was or not.
Okay. So Jeff, you know a little bit about this. Okay. The Warren Commission says that Oswald fired 3 shots in about 6 seconds, and he had 2 direct hits on JFK. One that entered the back, one that came in the back of the skull. All right. And of course, the one in the back of the skull was the kill shot. All right. Now, again, let me say that again. 3 shots in 6 seconds.
Right.
2 direct hits.
1 miss, right? 1 miss?
1 miss, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's
okay.
All right. Now, I don't know how many of your listeners know this, but the supposed murder weapon was what they call a bolt-action rifle. It's not a semi-automatic where you squeeze 1 shot off, and it's not an automatic where you get a steady stream. Every time you take a shot with a bolt-action rifle, you have to work the lever, bring it back, new cartridge goes into the chamber, push it back forward, and push it back down, and that's what loads the shell into the chamber. All right? In other words, it's a manually operated rifle.
Right, right.
How on earth could you get 3 shots in 6 seconds? Because every time you go ahead and fire that rifle, it has a scope, right? So the scope's going to be vibrating.
Right.
Every shot you take. So you have to wait for it to settle down and line it up again. Well,
you would have to be an expert marksman, right, Jim, to be able to do that?
Not even they could do it. Okay, the FBI brought in one of the best snipers that they could find. This guy actually wrote a book, okay, about military, his career as a military sniper. And it wasn't the FBI, it was CBS. because CBS was trying to put together this special in 1967 endorsing the Warren Commission. So they brought in this guy. And they said, go ahead, we'll give you a couple of tries at this. You know, he couldn't do it. He took something like 7 seconds to get off the 3 shots, and he didn't get 2 out of 3 direct hits. All right? All right. And by the way, that's what caused them to drop that whole experiment, and they went to a gallery of riflemen, but they cheated and they enlarged the target so it would be bigger than Kennedy with whatever.
Right.
Was aiming at anything, but supposedly what he was aiming at. So they couldn't find anybody who could do this under regular and normal and accurate circumstances.
So
what's even worse is that Oswald wasn't a good marksman at all.
That's okay. He was not. Okay. So explain to our audience the magic bullet theory. Tell us, how was that created, Jim?
All right. Well, it was created because a guy named Daryl Tomlinson moved a stretcher in Parkland Hospital. And when it rammed up against the wall, you had this alleged bullet, that was attached to the stretcher, rolled out, and Tomlinson picked it up. He gave it to the security officer, O.P. Wright, and O.P. Wright gave it to the Secret Service. They gave it to the FBI. And Arlen Specter, when he was commandeering the ballistics part of the Warren Commission, said, well, that must have been Conley's stretcher, and this must have been the bullet that passed through Kennedy and Conley and landed on his stretcher. All right, now, this is what is called the single bullet theory. This idea that Specter put together said that this bullet comes in from the 6th Fort, enters Kennedy's back, exits his throat, goes forward, hits Conley in the right side of his back, right below his shoulder blade, comes out the front of his chest, goes to the right, smashes Conley's wrist, then goes to the left and lands
so ridiculous
in his upper thigh. Okay? And somehow it worked its way out of its upper thigh and ended up on this stretcher in Parkland Hospital where Tomlinson found it. That's the magic bullet. And it's the sine qua non of the Warren Report. If there is no magic bullet, the whole Warren Report evaporates overnight. Okay?
All right. So you've made a convincing case. This whole idea is ridiculous. Was he really killed from in front? Because my thought has always been, it looks like, the impact pushes part of his brain behind where he was sitting. Jackie goes to pick up part of the brain. That would seem to me that would be coming from the front. Am I crazy?
No, she actually gave that to a doctor at Parkland Hospital. See, if you watch his Zapruder film, you'll see that Kennedy's body goes backward between his torque to the point that it actually bounces off the back seat of the limousine. And Jackie had a panic attack, and she reaches out into the trunk of the car. And they asked her, why were you doing that? And she said, because part of his brain went out the back of the trunk and I was retrieving it, which I said she did. And she gave it to the doctor at Parkland Hospital. So that is one of the big reasons that most people believe the combination of the Zapruder film and the combination of her getting part of his brain, out the back of the trunk. That is very telling evidence that the shot came from the right front.
Right.
The rear. Right.
And I've seen all kinds of theories, Jim, that maybe somebody was hiding in a manhole and shot from the street level. And then, of course, you have the whole grassy knoll, right? So, what are your theories about that?
I believe that it came from behind the picket fence, all right, on the so-called grassy knoll to Kennedy's right, elevated a little bit. And there's actually a sewer right at that point where most people believe that the shot came from. So whoever was the assassin there could have dove down directly after the assassination and hid in that sewer area. Okay, and that's what I believe. That's what I believe occurred. Now, I'm not saying there weren't any shots from the back. Okay, because there likely were. The back shot probably came from somewhere in that building, or maybe across the street at the Daltex building. But I believe the kill shot came from the picket fence up.
So we're looking at several assassins at play here.
Well, I would say that there were 3 points where the firing came from. One from the front, behind the picket fence. One from someone in the Texas School Book Depository. And the third point would be from the Daltex building, which is across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. All right, so it's what they call, if you talk to military guys like I have, it's what they call an L-shaped ambush, where you have an inverted L, somebody at the top of the L, somebody at the fulcrum of the L, and somebody at the end of the L. And these guys tell you that's the ideal situation because there's no escape from that kind of triangular crossfire that there was in DD5. It was an overkill operation.
Right. And of course, did he die there in the car or was it in the hospital? Because weren't they frantically working on him in the hospital trying to save his life? Yeah. And is it true that part of his brain is missing, that they've never recovered that?
Well, Kemp Clark was the chief of neurosurgery. And although other people tried to revive President Kennedy, all right, Kemp Clark, after about 10 minutes, said that the vital signs were all negative. All right, and there wasn't any point in trying to revive him, although they did try for a few moments. Okay, now, what you just suggested, this is, I believe, and it's one of the things I wrote about in this book, the chokeholds, the JFK assassination chokeholds, which is an anthology I contributed to. One of the chapters I wrote in this book addresses that very subject that you just brought up, which is one of the most amazing aspects of this whole case. All right. When they talked to the doctors who did the autopsy, they said that Kennedy's brain weighed 1,500 grams. Let me repeat that, 1,500 grams. There's a big problem with this. They did a study in Europe, which I think they measured something like 1,000 grains or maybe more. The average weight of a brain of an adult male was 1,340 grams. In other words, Kennedy's brain weighed above the average. How can that be, Jeff? I mean, anybody who watches the Crouere film, you see his head explode.
Right.
Halo of blood and tissue.
Exactly.
Pictures in the back seat of the car.
Right.
All this blood and tissue on the back. If you look at Jackie Kennedy's suit,
blood.
Right. So how on earth can Kennedy's brain weigh above about 160 grams above what an average brain weighs? And then if you go ahead and check out the witnesses at both Parkland and Bethesda, they'll tell you a large part of Kennedy's brain, especially in the back, was missing.
Right.
All right. Now, Of course, as Kevin Costner so memorably said in Oliver Stone's movie, you know, Kennedy's brain disappeared. All right. And so what we have today are pictures and illustrations of what I consider to be an ersatz brain. That simply cannot be, JFK's brain. And that is some of the most telling evidence that there is in this case today. Because the obvious question is, why did they have to do that? And secondly, the guy who took the pictures, a guy named John Stringer, when he was examined by the review board in a direct examination, they showed him pictures of the brain. He walked up to the easel. He was shocked. He said, wait a minute. You see those numbers down there at the bottom? That means this was taken as a press pack in a series. I didn't use a press pack. I never used a press pack when I was taking off computers. Then he said, this is Ansco film. I didn't use Ansco film. I used Kodak. And so when the chief counsel at the end of the examination said, are you ready to say that you did not take these pictures? And Stringer said, if that's Ansco and that's a press pack, I didn't take these pictures. So who took them?
So,
and why did somebody else have to take them?
Right. That, such important questions. All right. So in our final few minutes, Jim, let's go through the various possibilities here. From LBJ's involvement, books have been written about that. Do you believe there was any involvement from LBJ in this? Because he obviously had a lot to gain if Kennedy was gone. And we hear that he didn't like Kennedy, that there was a bad relationship. Was he involved, do you think?
No, actually, he had a good relationship with Kennedy.
He did?
Had a relationship with Bobby. Okay? I mean, LBJ liked JFK because JFK always treated him very well with respect. All right? But there was a few problems that he had, okay, that he felt Bobby was pushing them. All right, because Bobby wanted him out in 1964. I believe that LBJ was in his neck in the cover-up.
Okay.
I haven't seen any really credible evidence that he was actually on part of the conspiracy.
Right. So then you have the mafia. Carlos Marcello, of course, from our area. Rumors about the mafia's involvement. What say you?
Conte and Giancana, okay, and Johnny Rosselli. These guys. See, one of the things we didn't get to talk about was the CIA contracted out the murder of Fidel Castro to the mob. Okay, you could believe that. It's true. All right. And so further, Ruby met Trafficante. And when he was in detention, because Castro closed all the casinos and he swept up a lot of the owners, etc. And Jack Ruby went down to Trafficante as a go-between for another guy who works for Trafficante, Louis McWillie. All right? McWillie managed one of Trafficante's casinos in Havana prior to the revolution. All right? And so what a lot of people believe, they believe that once Oswald survived the Texas theater, that the CIA got in contact with their old buddies and they said, you have somebody down there who can polish this guy off for us. All right. And like the good buddies they were, they went in, they came through and they polished off Oswald. Okay. Ruby was take about an hour to go into that.
Right.
He was the perfect guy to get into the police headquarters.
Right. The police knew Ruby, right? He was well known to the police, correct?
Well, worse than that, he gave them free drinks. He gave them free.
Right.
He supplied them with girls.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, that's why he was
Okay.
allowed to walk around the police headquarters that weekend.
So then we move to the Russians or the Cubans involvement.
I
What do
don't
you say?
I don't buy either one of them because they both were trusting JFK by that time that he would come through on this rapprochement and détente. I don't believe that Oswald was a real communist.
Right.
I believe, like I said earlier, I believe that Oswald was really an agent provocateur.
So it's my belief that it was a inside job. The federal government, the deep state, the CIA. I think RFK Jr. has alluded to that, has said that that's what he believes. Do you believe that, Jim?
Yeah, but what I believe occurred, because remember that night at Bethesda, there were over 40 people there, and there was a lot of military brass there, and they controlled that autopsy. That's why the back wound in Kennedy was never dissected, and it should have been. That should have been one of the very first things they did, but they did not. All right, and they and according to one witness, Curtis LeMay was there. You know, what the heck was Curtis LeMay doing there?
Right. Right.
To be at JFK's autopsy. All right.
You know, under President Trump, we've had more of these files released in term one and in term two. Are there still files that are being held? Are there files that have been destroyed, Jim?
I hate to say this, but yes, to both questions. If you can believe it, this is really shocking. 62 years later, even though Trump has issued an executive order, and even though the review board said everything should have been declassified in 2017, they are still concealing files on the JFK case. So here's my question. If the Warren Commission was correct, why do we have this secrecy
Right.
2025 in defiance of Trump's executive order, in defiance of the legislative body that's set up the review board? Why? You know?
We only have a minute or two left, and I do want to ask you about this final connection to Louisiana. You know, we have Jim Garrison, of course, with the investigation. We have all the debates Oswald was doing down here. We have the connection to Carlos Marcello and the mob. But a guy on the Warren Commission was Hale Boggs from Louisiana, a very powerful member of Congress. And he died under mysterious circumstances in Alaska. They never found his plane. And it's been reported that he had some problems with the Warren Commission's report. Is that true?
He had more than problems. He cussed out Hoover right on the floor of Congress because as time went on and he learned more and more about what had happened, he literally said that Hoover lied his eyes out about everything, about the gun, about Oswald, about the ballistics, etc. And this is why after he died, his wife, who I believe was named Liddy Boggs,
Lindy.
she backed him and she voted for the House Select Committee on Assassinations because of the doubts that Hale Boggs had developed over the years. And I think he died in a plane crash in Alaska.
And they never found his plane.
And they never found the debris from the plane. Okay, which is really kind of incredible, you know. So yes, that's correct. That's another connection.
I know.
To the
Well, I mean, we could talk for hours, but it's been so fascinating to have you, Jim, and I really thank you for your time. Show our viewers again the book and where people can get it.
Okay, you can get the JFK Assassination Chokeholds online, either at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Abbey Books, etc. All right, it's really, it's and I usually don't pat myself on the back very often, but this is really a good compendium. It's an anthology of essays that blow open the whole JFK assassination. The JFK Assassination Chokehold.
I just want to thank you for your work over the years, really shedding light on this important topic, and look forward to having you back on our programs as we continue to dig for the truth in this assassination that still is captivating the American people. We still want answers. Jim, thank you for being with us. I also want to thank my good friend Jamie Glazov for allowing me the honor of hosting the Glazov Gang. Don't forget, folks, this is a fan-supported program. Please support the great work of the Glazov Gang and all the contributors, and I'm happy to be one of them. Thank you so much for joining us today, and be sure to catch the next episode of the Glazov Gang. Good day, everyone.